my favourite Chevy Chase movies. Hello and welcome to another video. This time around I thought I'd do something a little bit different and talk about some of my favourite movies with one of my favourite comic actors, Chevy Chase. I know Chevy's fallen out of favour in recent times, but I've always been a fan of him, though I only really rediscovered him a few years ago, I guess. I mean, I loved him in the 80s. Of course, in the 90s, things didn't quite go so well for him. Don't know whose fault that was, his or just the crap he was being given to do. And he kind of disappeared for a long while, apart from like Community and that. But in the last, I don't know, 5-6 years or so, obviously, ever since I got a Blu-ray player, I've started kind of sweeping up a lot of older movies, and that included a lot of Chevy movies, even ones that weren't necessarily on Blu-ray. And I just rediscovered just how great of a comic actor he was, and how much I really like a lot of his movies. In fact, having gone through his kind of filmography, I'm kind of the opinion now that he might actually be my favourite of the 80s comedy movie stars. As much as I love like Steve Martin and Bill Murray, I kind of think it's Chevy, to be honest with you. So this time around, I just thought I'd do like a list of some of my favourite movies of his. Not necessarily like a top 10 or anything, just talking about them. Now, probably the first really big movie that he's in that I really like is 1978's Foul Play, which he did with Goldie Hawn. It's sort of like a comedy thriller. Goldie Hawn is a young woman who somehow gets involved in the middle of a elaborate criminal conspiracy, and Chevy is the dashing deadpan detective who believes her even when nobody else doesn't, and tries to help. It's a fun, entertaining comedy thriller with its tongue firmly in its cheek, and Chevy's on great form. Now, a film I've done a separate review for, which I only discovered a few years ago, about 2019, was Oh Heavenly Dog, which apparently Chevy doesn't like. He says it's his worst movie, to which I have to say, have you seen any of your 90s movies, Chevy? I mean, really? Because I think Oh Heavenly Dog's great. I'd never even heard of it up until a few years ago. Like I said, I was doing kind of a sweep and trying to find more movies that he'd been in that I simply didn't know about. And I stumbled on that, never heard of it. There was a copy on YouTube. I've since picked up a better copy on DVD, but at the time I couldn't even find the DVD of it, and there was a fairly rough copy on YouTube which I watched. I had no idea what the hell it was about. I knew that Chevy was in it, I knew Jane Seymour was in it, and I knew Benji the dog was in it. I had no idea what the plot was, so I was somewhat taken aback and nonplussed when, like 20 minutes into the movie, Chevy gets killed and then sent back down to Earth to solve his own murder in the form of Benji the dog, albeit with Chevy still voicing his thoughts. Now, my first reaction to that was, oh boy, what the hell? But I kept watching it, and I actually ended up really enjoying Oh Heavenly Dog. I thought it was a great, fun movie. Silly and fun, and just pure entertainment in the way that movies used to be. Another from 1980, of course, it seemed like old times, which reunited him with Goldie Hawn. And Charles Grodin's in that as well. That's a really fun comedy where Chevy's a writer who's basically forced at gunpoint into helping to rob a bank, and then has to go on the run because everyone's after him, and he ends up hiding out at his ex-wife's house, who's Goldie Hawn. And that's a really funny, charming, and entertaining movie. And again, I don't know how it wasn't one I was particularly familiar with in the 80s. I think I might have seen it before, but it wasn't one that I watched very often, but I really liked it. Of course, there's the vacation movies, and I think it's fair to say that almost like his career in general, the National Lampoon's vacation movies are great in the 80s. And that's it. I didn't like Vegas Vacation, I'm afraid. And I mean, me, I go in with an open mind. In fact, I positively relish in being the contrary bastard who likes things that the the boring crowd don't. But I did not like Vegas Vacation. I'm sorry. I tried. I really did. Of the three, National Lampoon's Vacation, European Vacation, and Christmas Vacation, I'll be a contrary bastard there and say that my favourite is actually European Vacation. I actually think that's probably the best. And the original's probably the weakest of the original three, though it's still a classic. And I would agree that the kids are better. The original Rusty and the original Audrey are the best versions, I would say. But I just for sheer comedy, I think European Vacation's hilarious, and Christmas Vacation, of course, is a perfect Christmas movie. Fletch is another one. Now, interestingly, I rediscovered that and watched it for the first time in decades, but I don't know, mid 2010s on DVD, and I didn't think all that much to it. I don't know if it was, maybe it was the DVD quality, because it wasn't very good, because I actually picked up the Blu-ray for cheap a while back, and I watched it again like 6 months ago, and I loved it. I thought it was great. So maybe it was just the poor quality of the DVD didn't make it stand out all that much. Spies Like Us is not one of his greatest movies. It doesn't quite work. It's not funny enough. It's got a great premise, and it's got CHEVY on fine form and Dan Aykroyd. There's not as many laughs as it should be. That being said, I watched it last year on Blu-ray, and I found it entertaining. Not as funny as it should be, but entertaining. Three Amigos, of course, absolute classic. I was shocked to find the other day, some of the time, somebody arguing that since when is Three Amigos a classic? I'm like, since when isn't it, you bloody halfwit? Of course it's a classic. I mean, obviously it's just as much a Steve Martin and Martin Short film as it is CHEVY, but yeah, it's an 80s classic. You've got to love Three Amigos. Funny Farm is another one I don't think I'd seen before. I think I seem to vaguely recall seeing like bits of it, or some of the early scenes in Australia, either when I first emigrated or when I was on holiday in like 1989, and that was all I'd seen of it. So it was very much unfamiliar, and I really like that. And I mean, the last act of that movie in particular is absolutely hilarious. That's a classic. And of course, unfortunately, after the 80s, his stuff kind of goes down a bit. I will pick something out of the 90s, which is Memoirs of an Invisible Man, which I do actually think is somewhat underrated. The thing about Memoirs of an Invisible Man, it's not really a comedy. Even though it's CHEVY, it's not really a comedy. It seems to be more of an adventure fantasy. I mean, it's tongue-in-cheek, certainly, but it's not like a spoof or a full-on comedy. And indeed, although he's got some witty comments, CHEVY plays it fairly straight, and he plays it pretty much straight as a leading man, as an ordinary guy who's caught in a insane situation. And I thought he did a perfectly good job. I mean, in retrospect, you can perhaps see that as him maybe recognizing that the writing was on the wall in terms of what was happening to the 80s comedy stories in the 80s comedy stars in the 90s, and maybe that was an attempt to kind of do what Tom Hanks did so successfully and transition to something else. It didn't really work for him, but I thought he did a great job in Memoirs of an Invisible Man. It's not my absolute favorite of his films, but it's fine. And he was great in Community, of course. To me, that show really lost it once he left. What's the point, really? Without CHEVY, forget it. So yeah, I think if I have to choose absolute favourites, I think I'd choose like Foul Play, Seems Like Old Times, Oh Heavenly Dog, the Vacation movies, Fletch, and Funny Farm. I wasn't big on Nothing But Trouble. I vaguely remember my brother renting that on Laserdisc in the 90s and us turning it off. And I actually gave it another chance a while back. I bought the Blu-ray because a lot of people were kind of, reevaluating it and reassessing it as a comedy horror classic that was well ahead of its time. And you know me, I'm down for a reevaluation, but I ended up turning it off again. Sorry. But yeah, I love CHEVY. I think it's a great shame that he just kind of went downhill somewhat in the 90s with a lot of poor movies, and I don't think that was his fault. He was doing his best with the material he was getting, but it wasn't very good material. A lot of the best material in the 90s, of course, seemed to be going to the newcomers like Jim Carrey and that, which is a shame. I mean, it wasn't just CHEVY, of course. Steve Martin and that also kind of started going downhill in the 90s, which is a shame because I love the 80s comedy stars, and I love Chevy Chase.